Herr Sesemann, who had listened silently and with an expression of sad submission, now sprang to his feet. "Doctor, tell me honestly," he exclaimed, "have you really any hope for an improvement in her condition?" The doctor shrugged his shoulders. "Little," he said in a low voice. "But come, think for a moment of me, friend. Have you not a dear child who longs for you when you are away, and is delighted when you come home? You never have to return to a lonely house and sit down to a solitary table, and your child is well off at home. Although she has to go without much that others might enjoy, still she is, in some respects, more highly favored than a great many. No, Sesemann, you are not so much to be pitied. You are fortunate to be together. Think of my lonely house." Herr Sesemann began to stride up and down the room, as he was in the habit of doing whenever he was deeply absorbed in any matter. Suddenly, he stood still in front of his friend and clapped him on the shoulders. "Doctor, I have an idea. I cannot see you like this. You are no longer the same. You must get out of yourself a little, and do you know how? You shall undertake the journey, and visit the child Heidi in our place." The doctor was very much surprised at this proposal, and would have objected to it, but Herr Sesemann gave him no time. He was so delighted and filled with his new idea that he seized his friend by the arm and led him to his daughter's room. The doctor was always a delightful sight to sick Clara, for he treated her with great friendliness, and every time he came he had something lively and entertaining to tell her. She knew well why he could do so no longer, and she wished she could make him happy again. She held out her hand to him, and he sat down beside her. Herr Sesemann also moved up his chair, and taking Clara's hand, began to talk about the journey to Switzerland and how much pleasure he himself had taken in looking forward to it. He glided quickly over the most important fact that it was now out of the question, for he was somewhat afraid of the tears that would be sure to come. Then he passed on to the new plan and impressed Clara with the fact that her dear friend would be greatly benefited by taking this journey. The tears indeed came, and swam in Clara's blue eyes, although she tried her best to keep them back, for she knew how her papa disliked to see her cry. But it was hard to have it all ended when all the summer the prospect of this visit to Heidi had been her only joy and comfort during the long, lonely hours which she had endured. Clara was not in the habit of arguing, and she knew very well that her papa was denying her only what would lead to ill, and therefore ought not to be. She choked down her sobs and took refuge in the only hope remaining. She seized her good friend's hand, stroked it, and said entreatingly, "Oh, please, doctor, you will go to Heidi, won't you? And then come and tell me about everything up there, and what Heidi's doing, and her grandfather, and Peter, and the goats. I know them all so well. And then you must take what I want to send to Heidi. I've thought it all out, and something for the grandmother, too. Please, doctor, do go. And while you're gone, I will truly take all the cod-liver oil you prescribe." Whether this promise decided the matter or not, we do not know, but suppose it must be so, for the doctor smiled and said, "Then I must certainly go, Clarkin, for you will grow round and strong as Papa, and I would like to have you." "When must I start? Have you decided that too?" "Certainly, tomorrow." "Early, doctor," replied Clara. "Yes, she is right," said her father. "The sun is shining, the sky is blue, and no time is to be lost, for it is a shame not to be enjoying such a day in the Alps." The doctor had to laugh. "Next thing you'll be reproaching me for not being there already, Sesemann, so I shall do well to get away." Clara held the doctor fast. She had first to give him all sorts of messages for Heidi, and to remind him of so many things which he must notice and tell her about. The things she wished to send Heidi would be taken to him later, for Fraulein Rothenmeier would have to help pack them. She had just gone on one of her walks about the city, and was not likely to return very soon. The doctor promised to carry out all her directions, to start on the journey as soon as possible, and to give her a faithful account of everything he should see and do. Servants are often wonderfully clever at finding out long before they have been told what is going on in their master's house. Sebastian and Tinette must have been clever in a high degree, for just as the doctor, followed by Sebastian, was going down the stairs, Tinette entered Clara's room. "Bring me this box full of freshly nice cakes, such as we have with our coffee, Tinette," said Clara, pointing to a box that had been standing ready for some time. Tinette seized it by one corner and swung it scornfully in her hand. After she had closed the door, she said pertly, "It's well worth while." When, with his usual politeness, Sebastian had opened the front door, he said with a bow, if the doctor would be so kind as to give the little Mademoiselle Sebastian's regards. Oh, Sebastian, said the doctor pleasantly, do you know us so soon that I'm going away? Sebastian was obliged to cough. I am. I have. I don't know certainly. Oh, yes, I remember. As I happened to be passing through the dining room just now, I heard the Mademoiselle's name mentioned. It often appears that it often happens that we put one thought and another together, and so in that way. Oh yes, yes, indeed," said the doctor, laughing. And the more thoughts one has, the more one knows. Goodbye, Sebastian. I will deliver your message. The doctor was just about to pass through the open door when he met an obstruction. The strong wind had prevented Fraulein Rottenmeier from continuing her walk. She had returned and was entering the door. The wind puffed out the big shawl in which she was wrapped, and she looked exactly as if she were under full sail. The doctor started back instantly. Fraulein Rottenmeier had always shown a strange deference and politeness toward this man. She too started back with marked politeness, and for a time they stood there bowing and making room for each other. Then came such a strong gust of wind that Fraulein Rottenmeier was suddenly blown with full sail against the doctor. He was still able to turn aside, but the lady was driven a good way beyond him, so that she had to turn around again in order to speak courteously to the friend of the house. The absurd occurrence had put her in somewhat out of sorts, but the doctor had a way which soon smoothed her ruffled temper and put her in good humour again. He told her about his intended journey and begged her in the most taking way to pack the things for Heidi, as only she knew how to pack them. Then he took his departure. Clara had expected to have a struggle with Fraulein Rottenmeier before she would give her consent to send away all the things that Clara intended for Heidi, but this time she was happily disappointed. Fraulein Rottenmeier was unusually in good nature. She immediately removed everything on the large table in order to spread out on it all the articles that Clara had put together, and to pack them before her eyes. This was no easy task, the things were to be done up together, being of such different shapes. First came the thick cape with the hood, which Clara meant for Heidi, that she might be able to visit the grandmother the coming winter whenever she liked, and not have to wait for her grandfather and be wrapped in the sack to keep from freezing. Next came a thick, warm shawl for the old grandmother to wrap around her when the cold wind shook the hut. Then came the big box of cakes, also intended for the grandmother, that she might have something different from rolls to eat with her coffee. A huge sausage followed. Clara had first intended this for Peter because he never had anything but bread and cheese, but she changed her mind, fearing lest Peter in his delight should eat the whole sausage at once. So his mother Brigadier was to have it, and first take a good share of it for herself and for the grandmother, and then give Peter his portion at different times. Then there was a little bag of tobacco. This was for the grandfather, who liked so well to smoke his pipe when he sat in front of the hut in the evening. Last came a number of mysterious little bags, packages and boxes, which Clara had taken special delight in collecting, for Heidi was to find in them all sorts of surprises, which should give her great pleasure. At last the work was finished, and an imposing package lay on the floor, ready for the journey. Fraulein Rottenmeier looked down on it, and became absorbed in thought about the art of packing. Clara, for her part, cast looks of glad expectation toward it, for she saw Heidi before her as she would jump with surprise when the bundle reached her. Sebastian came in and swung the bundle up on his shoulder in order to take it at once to the doctor's house. And the mountains were glowing in the early dawn, and a fresh morning wind was blowing through the fir trees and rocking their old branches vigorously to and fro. Heidi opened her eyes, and the sound had awakened her. This roaring of the wind always stirred the very depths of Heidi's soul, and made her feel that she must run out under the great branches. She jumped from the bed, and could hardly wait to dress herself properly, but it had to be done, for Heidi knew very well that one should always be clean and tidy. And then she came down the ladder. Her grandfather's couch was already empty. She ran outdoors. There, in front of the hut, stood her grandfather, gazing up at the sky and all about, as he did every morning to see what the day was going to be. Rosy clouds floated above. The sky grew bluer and bluer, and the lights in the pasture land seemed flooded with bright gold as the sun was just rising above the lofty cliffs. "Oh, how beautiful! Oh, how beautiful! Good morning, grandfather," Heidi called as she came skipping along. "Well, "Are your eyes already opened?" said the grandfather in reply, offering his hand to Heidi to give her a morning greeting. Then Heidi ran under the fir trees and danced with delight under the swaying boughs as she heard the rushing and roaring above. And with every new gust of wind and loud blustering in the treetops, she shouted for joy and jumped a little higher. Meanwhile, the grandfather had gone to the shed and had milked Schwandli and Barely. Then he brushed and washed them for their journey up the mountain and brought them outside. When Heidi saw her friends, she ran to them and threw her arms around the neck of both of them and greeted them affectionately, and they bleated gladly and trustfully. Each of the goats was anxious to give proof of affection and pressed closer and closer to her shoulders, so that between them she was almost crushed. But Heidi was not afraid, and when the lively Barely butted and pushed too hard, with her head Heidi said, "No, Barely, you push like the big Turk," and immediately Barely drew back her head and retreated to a proper distance, and then Schwandli stretched up her head and bleated in a superior way, so that it was plain to be seen that she thought to herself, "No one shall say of me that I behave like Turk." For the snow-white Schwandli was rather more dignified than Barely. Peter's whistle from below was heard now, and soon all the lively goats came leaping up the mountain, the nimble Distelfink bounding ahead of the others. Heidi was at once in the midst of the flock, which pushed her hither and thither with loud, stormy greetings. She shoved them aside a little, for she wished to make her way to the timid Schneehöfli, who was always pushed away by the larger goats when struggling to reach Heidi. Peter now came along and gave one last startling whistle to frighten the goats and drive them on to the pasture, for he wished to have room to say something to Heidi. The goats sprang ahead a little at this whistle, so Peter was able to come forward and stand in front of Heidi. "You can come with me again today," he said somewhat peevishly. "No, I cannot, Peter," replied Heidi. "They may come from Frankfurt at any moment now, and I must be ready at home." "But you have said that a good many times already," growled Peter. "But it is still true, and it will be true until they come," replied Heidi. "Don't you know that I must be at home when they are coming from Frankfurt to see me? Don't you know that, Peter?" "They can come to the uncle," answered Peter with a snarl. The grandfather's deep voice then sounded from the hut. "Why doesn't the army move forward? Is it the fault of the field marshal or the troops?" In a twinkling, Peter wheeled around, swung his rod in the air, made it whistle, and all the goats, knowing the sound well, started off, and with Peter behind them, ran at full speed up the mountain. Since Heidi had returned home to her grandfather, every now and then she would remember something which she had not thought of before. Every morning she tried hard to make her bed, smoothing it until it looked quite even. Then she ran about the hut, placing every chair in its place, and if anything was lying or hanging about, she put it tidily into the closet. Then she brought a cloth, climbed up on a stool, and rubbed the table with it until it was perfectly clean. When her grandfather came in again, he would look around with satisfaction and say, "Now it is always like Sunday here." Heidi did not go away for nothing. Today also, after Peter had gone, and Heidi had breakfasted with her grandfather, she set about her work, but it seemed as if she would never finish. It was such a lovely morning outdoors, and every moment something happened to interrupt her in her tasks. Now a sunbeam came in so gaily through the window that it seemed exactly as if it said, "Come out, Heidi, come out!" So she could no longer stay in the house, and she ran out. The sparkling sunshine lay all around the hut, glistening on the mountains and far, far down in the valley, and the ground there on the cliff looked so golden and dry that she had to sit down and look around her for a little while. Then suddenly she remembered that the three-legged stool was still standing in the middle of the floor, and the table had not been cleared since breakfast. She jumped up quickly and ran back into the hut, but it was not long before the wind roared so mightily through the fir trees that Heidi felt it in every limb, and she had to go out again and dance a little with them, when all the branches above her rocked and swayed to and fro. Her grandfather, meanwhile, had all sorts of work to do in the shop. He came out to the door from time to time and looked smilingly at Heidi as she jumped about. He was just stepping back again when Heidi suddenly screamed at the top of her voice, "Grandfather, grandfather, come, come!" He hasted out again and almost afraid that something had happened to the child. Then he saw her running toward the cliff, screaming, "They're coming! They're coming! The doctor first of all!" Heidi rushed to meet her old friend. He held out his hand to greet her. When the child reached him, she grasped his outstretched arm affectionately and exclaimed with the greatest of joy, "How do you do, doctor? I thank you many thousand times." "Good morning, Heidi. But what are you thanking me for? Asked the doctor with a pleasant smile. Because I could come home again to my grandfather, explained the child. The doctor's face lighted up with sunshine. He had not expected such a reception in the Alps. In his sense of loneliness, all the while he was climbing the mountain, he had been wrapped in thought, and had not once noticed how beautiful it was around him, and that it was growing more and more beautiful. He had supposed that the child Heidi would hardly remember him. He had been so little of her, and seen so little of her, and as he was coming to give them a disappointment, he felt he would not be welcome because he had not brought the expected friends with him. Instead of this, Heidi's eyes gleamed with pure joy and full of gratefulness and love. She continued to cling to her good friend's arm. The doctor took the child by the hand with fatherly tenderness. "Come, Heidi," he said in a most friendly way. "Now, take me to your grandfather and show me where your home is." But Heidi remained standing where she was and looked wonderingly down the mountain. "But where are Clara and the grandmamma?" she asked. "Well, I shall have to tell you something that will pain you as well as myself," replied the doctor. "You see, Heidi, I have come alone. Clara has been very ill, and was not able to take the journey, and so the grandmamma did not come either. But in the spring, when the days are warm and long again, then they will surely come." Heidi was very much distressed. She could hardly realize that what she had been looking forward to as so certain suddenly had become impossible. She stood motionless for a time, as if bewildered by the disappointment. The doctor stood silently in front of her, and everything around was still except the wind blowing through the fir trees high above them. Then it suddenly occurred to Heidi why she had run down the mountain, and that the doctor was there. She looked up at him. There was something sad in the eyes looking down at her, such as she had never seen before. He had never looked at her so in Frankfurt. It went to Heidi's heart. She could not bear to see anyone look sad, and not least of all the good doctor. It certainly must be because Clara and the grandmamma could not come with him. She quickly sought some way to console him. "Oh, it really won't be long before spring will be here again, and then they will surely come," said Heidi comfortingly. "With us, it never is a great while, and then they can stay much longer. Clara will like that much better. Now we will go up to my grandfather." Hand in hand with her good friend, she climbed up to the hut. Heidi was so very anxious to make the doctor happy that she began to assure him again that it was such a little while before the long summer days would come again, that it was hardly noticeable, and in this way she became comforted herself, and called up to her grandfather quite cheerfully. "They did not come, but it won't be long before they will be here too." The doctor was no stranger to the grandfather. The child had told him so much about her friend. The old man held out his hand to his guest and gave him a hearty welcome. Then they both sat down on the bench beside the hut, and made a little place for Heidi. The doctor kindly motioned her to sit beside him. Then he began to relate how Herr Sesemann had urged him to take the journey, and how he himself had felt that it would be good for him, since he had not been quite strong and well for some time. He then whispered in Heidi's ear that something which had come from Frankfurt with him would soon come up the mountain, and that it would give her much greater pleasure than the old doctor could. Heidi was very eager to know what it might be. The grandfather urged the doctor to spend the beautiful autumn days on the Alm, or at least to come up every fine day, for he could not invite him to remain up there because he had no way of making him comfortable at night. But he advised his guest not to go back as far as Ragaz, but to take a room down in Derfli in a simple but well-kept inn, which he would find there. In that way the doctor would be able to come up the Alm every morning, which the uncle thought would do him good. Moreover, he would be glad to take the gentleman farther up the mountain whenever he liked. This plan very much pleased the doctor, and he decided to carry it out. Meanwhile the sun announced that it was midday. The wind had long since ceased, and the fir trees were perfectly still. The air was still, mild and delicious for such a height, and felt refreshingly cool round the sunny bench. The uncle rose and went into the hut, but immediately came out again, bringing a table which he placed in front of the bench. "There, Heidi, now bring out what we need to eat," he said. "The gentleman will have to make the best of it, for if our cooking is plain, our dining-room is all that could be desired." "I think so, too," replied the doctor as he gazed down into the valley bathed in sunlight. "And I accept your invitation, for everything must taste good up here." Heidi ran back and forth like a weasel, and brought out everything she could find in the cupboard, for she found it an immense pleasure to be able to entertain the doctor. Meanwhile the grandfather prepared the meal and came out with a steaming jug of milk and the shining golden toasted cheese. Then he cut clear slices of delicious rosy meat which he had dried up there in the pure air. The whole year through the doctor had not eaten a single meal which tasted so good as this dinner did. "Yes, indeed, our Clara must come here," he said. "She would gain new strength, and if she could have such an appetite as I have today, she would become plump and strong as she never has been in all her life." Then someone came climbing up from below with a big package on his back. When he reached the hut, he threw his burden down on the ground and drew a long breath of fresh mountain air. "Ah, here is what came with me from Frankfurt," said the doctor, rising and drawing Heidi after him. He went to the package and began to undo it. After the first heavy wrapping was removed, he said, "There, child, now open it yourself and take out your treasures." Heidi did so, and when everything rolled out together, her eyes grew big with astonishment as she gazed at the things. When the doctor stepped back again and lifted the cover of the big box, saying to Heidi, "See what the grandmother has for her coffee," then she exclaimed with delight, "Oh, no, now at last the grandmother can have some nice cakes to eat." She danced around the box and was anxious to put everything together immediately and hastened down to the grandmother's. But her grandfather promised her that toward evening they would go down with the doctor and take the things with them. Then Heidi found the nice bag of tobacco and brought it quickly to the grandfather. It pleased him very much. He immediately filled his pipe with it, and the two men sat on the bench talking about all sorts of things and puffing out great clouds of smoke, while Heidi ran back and forth from one of her treasures to another. Suddenly she came back to the bench, stood in front of her guest, and as soon as there was a pause in the conversation, said very decidedly, "No, nothing has given me any more pleasure than the old doctor has." The two men had to laugh a little, and the doctor said he wouldn't have thought it. When the sun went down behind the mountains, the guest rose to take his way back to Derflin to find lodging there. The grandfather put the box of cakes, the big sausage, and the shawl under his arm. The doctor took Heidi by the hand, and they went down the mountain to goat herd Peter's hut. There Heidi had to leave them. She was to wait inside with her grandmother until her grandfather should come for her, after going with his guest down to Derflin. When the doctor, as he said good night, offered his hand to Heidi, she asked, "Would you like to go up to the pasture with the goats tomorrow?" That was the loveliest spot she knew. "To be sure, Heidi," he replied, "we will go together." Then the men continued their way, and Heidi went into the grandmother's hut. First she dragged in the box of cakes with difficulty. Then she had to go out again to bring in the sausage, for her grandfather had laid everything down in front of the door. Then she had to go out once more to bring in the big shawl. She brought them all as close to the grandmother as possible, so that she might touch them and know what they were. She laid the shawl in her lap. "They are all from Frankfurt, from Clara and her grandmamma," she exclaimed. The amazed Brigitte was so affected by her surprise that she stood motionless, watching Heidi as she, with the greatest difficulty, dragged in the heavy articles and spread out everything before her and the highly astonished grandmother. "Surely, grandmother, you are terribly pleased with the cakes, aren't you? Just see how soft they are," Heidi exclaimed again and again. The grandmother replied, "Yes, yes, indeed, Heidi. What good people they are." Then she would stroke the soft, warm shawl with her hand and say, "But this is something splendid for the cold winter. I never dreamed I should ever have anything so splendid in my life." Heidi was very much surprised that the grandmother should be more delighted with the grey shawl than with the cakes. Brigitte continued standing before the sausage as it lay on the table and gazed at it almost with reverence. In all her life she had never seen such a giant sausage, and she was going to possess it, and even cut it, and she could not believe it possible. She shook her head and said timidly, "We must first ask the uncle what it is meant for." But Heidi said very decidedly, "It is meant to eat, and for nothing else.